Toi Soviet lay, tuan bo truyen voi, jai ju moi sao en hin nam, tram gen moi bei, ing hin tu theo yeu kao. The candle flame stood perfectly still. Outside, the wind screamed across the Kansas prairie. It howled like something wounded, something desperate, something that wanted to tear apart everything in its path. Snow drove sideways through the darkness. The temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Drifts piled against buildings and fences, burying them, swallowing them whole. It was January of 1893. The worst blizzard in 50 years was trying to destroy everything that lived on the Great Plains. But inside a small cabin coated in gray clay, a cabin that looked like nothing more than a misshapen mud hut rising from the frozen earth, the air was warm, still, peaceful, and the candle on the rough wooden table burned straight up. Not a flicker, not a waver, not the slightest tremor. Just a golden finger of light pointing toward heaven. Rosa Vorel sat beside that candle. She was 37 years old. Her hands were rough from months of hard labor. Her dark hair was streaked with the first threads of gray. But her eyes, those dark eyes that had seen so much, were filled with something she had almost forgotten was possible. Peace. She watched her 6-year-old daughter Milada sleep on a pallet near the cast-iron stove. The child's cheeks were pink with warmth. Her breathing was deep and easy. No coughing, no gasping, no blue-tinged lips fighting for air. 2 years ago, a doctor had looked at this child and told Rosa to prepare herself. Another harsh winter, he said, would likely kill her. Now Milada slept like an angel. While a killing storm raged just inches away, Rosa looked at the flame again. Straight, true, unmoving. She thought about everything it had taken to reach this moment. The doubt that had gnawed at her for months. The mockery from neighbors who called her husband insane. The nights she had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life. She thought about Bohumir, her husband, asleep in the corner, his calloused hands finally at rest. The man everyone had called a madman. The man who had promised her he could save their daughter by burying their house in mud. She thought about faith, what it costs, what it gives. And she knew, watching that still flame burn in the warm, quiet air, that she had a story to tell. This is that story, not just about how a cabin was built, though that is part of it. This is about what it means to trust someone when the whole world says you are a fool. What it means to stay when everything inside you screams to run. What it means to believe in a person so completely that you are willing to bet your children's lives on that belief. This is about the walls we build, the ones made of clay and horsehair, and the ones made of faith. If you have ever loved someone enough to follow them into the unknown, if you have ever had to choose between the safety of what you know and the terrifying promise of something new, then this story is for you. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone when everyone around you said you were wrong? Have you ever bet everything on a person, not because you had proof they were right, but because you believed in who they were? If you have, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you are new to this channel, please take a moment to subscribe. This journey we are about to take together is one you will not want to miss. Now let me take you back to the autumn of 1891, to the day Rosa Vorel first set foot on the Kansas prairie, and realized she might have made a terrible mistake. The wind was the first thing she noticed. Rosa had grown up in Prague, a city of narrow cobblestone streets and buildings that pressed close together, shoulder to shoulder, like old friends keeping each other warm. In Prague, the wind was something that happened far above the rooftops. It made church bells sway and rattled shutters on the highest floors, but it rarely touched the ground where ordinary people walked. She had taught school in a solid brick building with thick walls and double-paned windows. The worst of winter meant frost on the glass, and the pleasant necessity of sitting closer to the ceramic stove. She had never known cold that could not be conquered by a good fire and a warm blanket. Kansas wind was something else entirely. It came across the prairie like an invisible river. Endless, relentless, unstoppable. There was nothing to break it for hundreds of miles in any direction. No buildings, no forests, no hills, just grass and sky stretching to the horizon, and the wind pouring across all of it with a force that seemed almost personal. It pressed against Rosa like a living thing. It tugged at her skirts, trying to tear them from her body. It pulled pins from her hair and sent dark strands whipping across her face. It pushed her backward, step by step, as she tried to climb down from the wagon that had brought them from the train station. Her husband, Bohumir, stood beside her. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands scarred and calloused from decades of working with fire and clay. In Prague, he had been a komnaz, a master builder of the great ceramic stoves that heated the homes of the wealthy. His stoves were works of art. Massive constructions of hand-glazed tiles in rich blues and greens, with precisely engineered smoke channels that curved through the body of the stove like the chambers of a heart. A Bohumir Vorel stove could take a single load of wood and radiate gentle, even heat, for an entire day. The secret was not in the fire itself, but in the vessel that contained it. A vessel so perfectly sealed that not a breath of warmth could escape. He had been successful, respected. He employed 3 apprentices and turned away more work than he could accept. Their apartment in Prague was comfortable, filled with books and music and the smell of Rosa's cooking. But Bohumir had also been restless. "The old country is too small," he told her one evening, "too crowded, too full of rules and traditions and people who want things done the way they have always been done. America is different, Rosa. In America, a man can build something new. He can own his own land. He can raise his children in freedom." Rosa had believed him. She had always believed him. From the day they met, when she was a young teacher, and he was an ambitious craftsman just starting to make his name, she had believed in his vision. His dreams had become her dreams. His ambitions had become her own. So she gave up her teaching position, said goodbye to her mother and her sisters, knowing she would probably never see them again, packed their belongings into heavy trunks, and followed her husband halfway around the world with their 2 children. Now she stood on the Kansas prairie, wind trying to tear the clothes from her body, dust in her eyes and her mouth and her hair. And she wondered, for the first time since they had set out on this journey, if she had destroyed her family. Their son Aldrich stood by the wagon. He was 10 years old, tall for his age, but thin, with his father's dark hair and his mother's watchful eyes. He was trying very hard to look brave. His arm was wrapped protectively around his little sister. Milada was 6. She was small for her age, delicate as a bird, with enormous dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She had been sick on the ship crossing the Atlantic, spending days in their cramped cabin while Rosa held her and prayed and listened to the terrible sounds of retching. She had been sick again on the train from New York. The motion and the coal smoke and the strange American food all conspiring against her fragile constitution. Even now, standing in the bright autumn sunshine, her face was pale. Too pale. There were shadows under her eyes that should not have been there. And when she breathed, Rosa could hear a faint wheeze, a sound like wind through a cracked door. The land agent was a cheerful man in a brown suit, who seemed completely immune to the wind. He had met them at the train station and driven them out here in a wagon that creaked and swayed over the rutted prairie tracks. Now he stood beside them, gesturing expansively at the empty grassland. "This is your quarter section," he announced proudly. 160 acres of the finest farmland in Kansas. You have good water in the creek just over that rise, and plenty of timber for building along the south ridge. Get your cabin up before the first snow. No problem at all. Rosa looked at the vast emptiness stretching in every direction. The grass was cured to the color of old brass, rippling in the wind like the surface of a restless golden ocean. There were no buildings, no fences, no roads, no signs of human habitation anywhere she looked. Just grass and sky and that endless, maddening wind. "Where are the neighbors?" she asked. Her English was still careful, each word precisely pronounced, but she had studied hard on the ship and the train. She was determined to master this new language. The land agent pointed toward a distant smudge on the horizon. "The Crail Ranch is about 4 miles in that direction," he said. "Haddon Crail runs about 1,000 head of cattle out there. Good people. He was a captain in the war. He will help you get settled. 4 miles. In Prague, 4 miles would have encompassed half the city. Thousands of people. Hundreds of shops and churches and schools. Here, 4 miles meant that their nearest neighbor was invisible, unreachable, a stranger who might as well have lived on the moon. And that way?" Rosa pointed in another direction, the Gentry place. "Silas Gentry farms about 300 acres of wheat. Good fellow, if a bit rough around the edges. After that, you have the Selridge homestead, maybe 6 miles out. Young family, with a little girl about your daughter's age." Rosa absorbed this information in silence. She had known, intellectually, that Kansas would be different from Prague. She had read about the American frontier in books and newspapers. She had looked at maps and studied photographs, but she had not truly understood what different meant until this moment. Standing in the grass with the wind pushing against her and no sign of human life anywhere she looked. Holding her sick daughter's hand while her son tried not to cry. "This is not a place," she thought. "This is an absence, an emptiness waiting to swallow us whole." But Bohumir was smiling. He had walked away from the wagon while the land agent talked. Now he stood about 50 yards distant, his weathered face turned into the wind, his eyes scanning the landscape with an expression Rosa had not seen since they left Prague. Hope. Pure, radiant hope. "We will build here," he called out, pointing to a slight rise in the terrain. "Good drainage. The creek is close enough for water, far enough to avoid flooding in the spring." He walked back to join them, his boots crushing the dry grass, his whole body vibrating with energy and purpose. "This is good land, Rosa," he said, taking her hands in his. "This is where we will make our life. Our children will grow up here. Our grandchildren will inherit this soil. We will build something that lasts." She looked into his eyes, those dark eyes she had loved for 15 years, and she saw everything he was feeling. The excitement, the determination, the absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. She wanted to believe him. She truly did. "We will be happy here," Bohumir said. He squeezed her hands and smiled at her with all the confidence of a man who had never failed at anything he set his mind to. Rosa nodded. She tried to smile back. She told herself that everything would be fine, that they would build their cabin and plant their crops and make friends with the neighbors and somehow turn this empty wilderness into a home. She told herself these things, but standing there in the wind, holding her sick daughter's hand, she could not quite make herself believe them. Then winter came. They built the cabin in 3 weeks. Bohumir worked from dawn until darkness forced him to stop. He felled cottonwood trees along the creek bank, trimmed them into logs, notched them at the corners so they would stack securely. His hands remembered the work, even though his body had spent years doing finer labor. The axe rose and fell. The saw bit into wood. The logs piled up, one on top of another, until walls began to take shape. Aldrich helped as much as a 10-year-old boy could. He carried tools back and forth. He held logs in place while his father notched them. He learned new words, American words, for things he had never seen before. Draw knife, adze, chinking. He worked without complaining, even when his hands blistered and his back ached, because he understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things they cannot put into words, that his family's survival depended on finishing this cabin before winter arrived. Rosa split her time between helping with construction and caring for Mulata. The little girl's cough had not improved since they arrived. If anything, it had gotten worse. The dry prairie air seemed to irritate her lungs, and the constant wind carried dust that made her wheeze and gasp. Rosa brewed teas from the dried herbs she had brought from Prague. She kept Mulata wrapped in blankets, even in the warm autumn sunshine. She watched and worried and prayed. The land agent had recommended a local method for sealing the gaps between the logs. Mix clay from the creek bed with sand and prairie grass, he told them. Pack it in tight between the logs. That is how everyone does it out here. Bohumir followed these instructions carefully. He was not a man who dismissed local knowledge. He understood that the people who had lived here for years, who had survived the winters and the storms and the endless challenges of prairie life, must know something about what worked and what did not. So he gathered clay from the creek bank and mixed it with sand and dried prairie grass, just as he had been told. He packed this mixture into every gap between the logs, pressing it firmly, smoothing it carefully into what looked like a solid seal. The cabin, when it was finished, looked like every other homesteader's cabin on the prairie. 4 walls of round cottonwood logs, notched at the corners and stacked 8 feet high. A roof of split cedar shakes, angled to shed rain and snow. A single window, covered with oiled paper that let in a dim golden light. A door that hung slightly crooked on its leather hinges, but closed firmly enough to keep out the worst of the wind. A cast-iron stove, purchased at considerable expense from the general store in the nearest town, sat in one corner. Its black pipe rose up through a hole in the roof, and when Bohumir lit the first fire, smoke curled up into the autumn sky like a prayer of thanksgiving. The cabin was small. It was rough. There was barely enough room for the 4 of them to move around without bumping into each other, but it was theirs. Their first home in America. The foundation of everything they hoped to build. Rosa stood inside on the day they finished, looking around at the space where she would raise her children. The logs still smelled of sap and fresh-cut wood. Sunlight came through the oiled paper window in a warm amber glow. The stove was cold, but she could imagine it burning, filling the little room with heat, transforming this rough shelter into something that felt like home. "We will make this work," she told herself. "Whatever comes, we will face it together. We will be happy here." She believed it. She truly did. Then the first real winter of her life arrived. The first snows came in early November. Light and dry, they dusted the prairie like powdered sugar and melted away by noon. Rosa watched these early snowfalls with something approaching hope. Perhaps the stories she had heard about Kansas winters were exaggerated. Perhaps they would be gentler than everyone claimed. The second snow came a week later. Heavier this time, it lasted 2 days before the sun burned it away. The children played in it, Aldrich teaching his sister how to make snowballs, their laughter rising into the cold, clear air. Rosa let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they would be all right. Then December arrived, and the true cold came with it. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single afternoon. The sky turned the color of bruised metal, and the wind, that constant companion that had been merely annoying in autumn, transformed into something savage, something that seemed actively malevolent. It screamed across the prairie at 40 miles an hour, picking up the dry snow that had fallen and hurling it horizontally through the air until it was impossible to tell whether the snow was falling from the sky or simply being recycled endlessly from the ground. Inside the cabin, Rosa built up the fire until the cast iron stove glowed red. She piled blankets around Mulata, who had developed a deep, rattling cough that would not go away. She stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frame and pushed an old coat against the crack beneath the door. None of it helped. The cold came through the walls as if the walls did not exist. It seeped through the chinking between the logs, through microscopic cracks and gaps that were invisible to the eye but perfectly apparent to the freezing air. The wind found every weakness, every flaw, every place where the clay and grass mixture had dried and cracked or simply failed to seal properly. The cabin did not keep the cold out. It merely slowed it down. On the first truly bitter night, when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind howled like a chorus of demons, Rosa tried to light a candle. She wanted to read to her children. She wanted to distract them from the cold that was creeping closer, despite the roaring fire in the stove. She struck a match and touched it to the wick. For one moment, the flame caught and burned straight and true. Then, the drafts hit it. The flame bent sideways. It flickered wildly, dancing and jerking, pushed this way and that by invisible currents of air. Sometimes it bent so far over that it was nearly horizontal to the tabletop, straining against the wick as if trying to escape. Rosa moved the candle to different spots on the table, trying to find a place where the flame would burn straight. There was no such place. The air inside the cabin was in constant motion, a frigid river flowing in through one wall and out through another, carrying away the heat from the stove as fast as the iron could produce it. She watched that bent and flickering flame for a long moment, and she understood, for the first time, something that would change everything. They were not fighting the cold. They were fighting the wind. The cold outside was not crawling through the thick log walls. The walls themselves were decent insulation. No, the cold was being carried into the house on currents of moving air. The wind pushed against the north side of the cabin and forced frigid air through every tiny crack. That invading air shoved the warm air out through cracks on the south side. A constant invisible river of cold flowed through their home, stealing their heat, stealing their warmth, stealing their lives. She gave up on the candle. She gathered her children close to the stove, wrapped them in every blanket they owned, and held them through the night while the wind screamed outside. That night, Rosa understood something else. The wind was winning, and unless something changed, the wind would kill them all. The winter of 1891 to 1892 became a long nightmare of survival. They burned through their entire woodpile by the middle of January. Bohemir spent desperate, freezing days trudging through waist-deep snow to the creek, cutting frozen branches with numb fingers, dragging them back to the cabin on a makeshift sled to thaw beside the stove before they could be burned. The work was exhausting. It was dangerous, and it was barely enough. The fire consumed wood faster than he could gather it, and still the cabin never truly grew warm. Mulata's cough grew worse with each passing week. It was a deep, rattling sound that seemed to come from somewhere low in her chest. from places that should have been pink and healthy, but were clearly struggling. It woke Rosa in the middle of the night, every night, and filled her with a terror that had no remedy. She brewed teas from the dried herbs she had brought from Prague, precious supplies she had been saving for emergencies. She rubbed goose fat on the child's chest, an old remedy her grandmother had sworn by. She kept Malata wrapped in blankets until the girl could barely move, creating a cocoon of warmth around her small body. Nothing helped. The cold kept coming through the walls. Malata kept coughing, and Rosa kept praying to a god who seemed very far away from this frozen, wind-blasted prairie. In early February, a traveling doctor passed through the region. He was a tired man in his 60s, with kind eyes and a leather bag full of medicines that he admitted probably would not work. He had been making this circuit for 30 years, visiting the scattered homesteads, doing what he could with limited supplies and even more limited knowledge. He examined Malata carefully. He listened to her breathing with a wooden tube pressed against her thin chest. He checked the color of her fingernails, looked into her eyes, felt the glands in her neck. Then he asked Rosa to step outside with him. They stood in the bitter wind. The doctor hunched inside his heavy coat, Rosa wrapped in a shawl that did almost nothing to keep out the cold. The sun was bright, but it gave no warmth. It just made the snow glitter like scattered diamonds. "Her lungs are very weak," the doctor said quietly. His breath came out in white clouds that the wind tore apart immediately. "There is fluid building up in there. I believe she may have had pneumonia at some point, perhaps on the ship or the train. She recovered from the acute infection, but the damage was done. Her lungs are scarred. They cannot fight off infection the way healthy lungs can." Rosa felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What does that mean? The doctor was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. The voice of a man who had delivered bad news too many times. "It means that another winter like this one could kill her. The cold, the damp, the constant drafts. These are the worst possible conditions for lungs like hers. She needs warmth, Mrs. Vorel. Consistent warmth, dry air, protection from the wind. Is there nothing we can do? You could return east. The climate in Pennsylvania or Virginia is milder. Or you could go further south, to Texas or New Mexico. The dry heat there is supposed to be good for weak lungs." Rosa shook her head slowly. "We cannot return east. We spent everything we had to come here. This land is all we have left." The doctor nodded. He had heard this story before. The West was full of people who had burned every bridge behind them, who had gambled everything on a new start and had nowhere left to go. "Then I will pray for a mild winter next year," he said. He reached out and touched Rosa's arm gently. "And you should prepare yourself, Mrs. Vorel, just in case." He climbed back into his wagon and drove away, disappearing over a snow-covered rise, leaving Rosa standing alone in the wind with a truth she could not speak. She did not tell Bohumir what the doctor had said. She could not bear to see the look that would come into his eyes, the guilt, the self-recrimination. He had brought them here. He had promised them a better life. If Malata died because of that promise, it would destroy him, so Rosa carried the knowledge alone. A cold weight in her chest that never went away, never lightened, never let her forget for a single moment what was at stake. Every time Malata coughed in the night, Rosa heard the doctor's words. Another winter like this one could kill her. She prayed for a miracle. But she did not truly believe one would come. The breaking point arrived on a night in late February. The wind had been howling for 3 days straight, and the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. The cabin was an icebox despite the fire roaring in the stove. Frost coated the inside of the window like a layer of white fur. The water bucket by the door had frozen solid. Rosa woke in the darkness to a sound that stopped her heart. Milada was not coughing. She was choking, gasping, fighting for every breath, as if the air itself had turned to water in her lungs. Rosa threw off her blankets and stumbled across the frigid cabin to her daughter's pallet. In the dim red glow of the dying stove, she could see Milada's face, pale as paper, lips tinged with blue, eyes wide with terror. Her small mouth was opening and closing, but almost no air was getting through. Bohumir was beside her in an instant, torn from sleep by Rosa's cry of alarm. He grabbed his daughter, lifted her upright, pounded on her thin back with his broad palm, trying to clear whatever was blocking her airway. Milada coughed, choked, coughed again. Her whole body convulsed with the effort of trying to breathe. "She is not breathing," Rosa heard herself say. The words came from somewhere outside herself, flat and strange. "Oh God, she is not breathing." She began to cry. Great sobbing wails of terror and confusion. It was the most beautiful sound Rosa had ever heard. They sat together on the floor of the cabin for the rest of that endless night. All four of them huddled together, Aldrich awake now too, his face pale with fear, pressed close to his family for warmth and comfort. The wind screamed outside, trying to find a way in. The cold crept through the walls despite everything they could do to stop it. Rosa held her daughter and felt the fragile flutter of her heartbeat against her chest. She felt how thin Milada had become, how light, how terrifyingly fragile. This child who had laughed and played and chased butterflies through the summer grass was now barely more than bones and breath. And Rosa understood, with a terrible clarity, that they had come within seconds of losing her. When the first gray light of dawn began to show around the edges of the frosted window, Rosa spoke. Her voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes from going beyond fear into something colder and more final. "If she dies next winter," she said to Bohumir, "I will never forgive you for bringing us here." She paused, drew a breath, let it out slowly, "And I will never forgive myself for following you." The words hung in the frigid air between them, heavy as stones, sharp as broken glass. Bohumir did not respond. His face had gone very still, and Rosa saw something break behind his eyes. The confidence that had carried him across an ocean and a continent. The certainty that he had made the right choice. All of it crumbling in that moment. But she also saw something else. Something that flickered to life in the depths of his dark eyes even as the confidence died. Something that looked almost like resolve. He did not say anything. He simply held his family closer and stared at the wall of the cabin with an expression Rosa could not read. She did not know it then. But in that moment, watching the wind-driven drafts stir dust along the floor, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall with each precious breath, Bohumir Vorel was already making a plan. He had spent his entire life building vessels to contain heat. Massive ceramic stoves that could hold a fire's warmth for a full day, keeping it inside, radiating it slowly, because they were sealed. Completely sealed. Not the smallest crack for the heat to escape through. For the first time since coming to Kansas, he looked at his cabin not as a shelter, but as a vessel. A leaking vessel. A vessel that let the cold pour in and the warmth pour out through 1,000 invisible holes. And he began to think about how to seal it. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had a moment when everything changed? When crisis became clarity? When the worst night of your life planted a seed that would grow into something better? If you have, I would love to hear about it in the comments. I believe our darkest moments often carry our greatest lessons, that the breaking point is sometimes also the turning point. And if this story is speaking to you, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps more people find these tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Now let me tell you what happened when spring finally arrived on the Kansas prairie. Spring came slowly to the Flint Hills. The snow melted in fits and starts, revealing dead brown grass that would not turn green for another month. The creek swelled with meltwater, its banks overflowing into the low meadows, then gradually subsiding as the thirsty ground drank its fill. The wind remained constant, but it lost its killing edge, moderating from brutal to merely relentless. Rosa watched the thaw with mixed feelings. Relief that they had survived. Dread of what the next winter might bring. Milada had improved slightly as the weather warmed. She still coughed, but not as violently. She had regained a little weight, a little color in her cheeks. But Rosa could not forget the doctor's words, could not stop hearing them every time she looked at her daughter's thin face. Another winter like this one could kill her. Meanwhile, Bohumir had become a man possessed. He rose before dawn each day and walked down to the creek, where he had discovered a deposit of dense blue clay along the banks. He spent hours digging it out with a shovel, loading it into a battered wheelbarrow, carting it back to the homestead, and piling it beside the cabin. Load after load, day after day, until the pile was taller than Milada. When Rosa asked what he was doing, he gave only brief answers. Testing, mixing, preparing. He mixed samples of the clay with different proportions of sand, forming small bricks that he set in the sun to dry. He examined each brick obsessively, checking for cracks, testing its hardness with his thumbnail, sometimes breaking them in half to study the texture inside. He was searching for something, some perfect combination of ingredients, but he did not explain what. In late April, he rode into town and came back with a wagon full of strange supplies. Lime in heavy sacks, sand of a finer grade than what he could dig locally. More sacks of dried material that Rosa did not recognize. One of the sacks was moving slightly, bulging with something inside. "What is that?" she asked, pointing at it. "Horsehair," Bohumir said. "From the Crail Ranch. I paid one of their stable hands to collect it for me. Horsehair, clay, sand, lime." Rosa knew enough about her husband's craft to recognize the components of mortar. The same mortar he had used for 20 years to seal the fireboxes of his ceramic stoves, to create vessels that could withstand temperatures hot enough to melt iron. But mortar was for building stoves, for sealing fireboxes against the incredible heat of burning wood. What did mortar have to do with a cabin? That evening, after the children were asleep, Bohumir finally explained. He drew diagrams in the dirt floor of the cabin, showing Rosa how a kamnaj stove worked. The firebox at the center, completely sealed with thick clay mortar. The smoke channels winding through the body of the stove, carrying heat from the fire to every part of the structure. The ceramic tiles that absorbed that heat and radiated it slowly, evenly, for hours after the fire had burned down to ash. "The key is the seal," he said, his finger tracing the lines in the dirt. "A stove that leaks is worthless. Even a tiny crack will let the heat escape. But a stove that is perfectly sealed will hold its warmth all day. The heat has nowhere to go, so it stays inside." Rosa nodded slowly. She understood this. She had seen his stoves working in Prague, had felt the gentle warmth radiating from their tiled surfaces long after the fires inside had died. "Now think of this cabin," Bohumir continued. He drew a rough square in the dirt, representing their home. It is full of holes. The chinking between the logs has cracked. The gaps around the window leak air. The door does not seal properly. There are 100 places where the wind comes through. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was intense. Urgent. We are not fighting the cold, Rosa. We are fighting the wind. The cold outside is not crawling through the logs. The logs are good insulation. No, the cold is being carried into the house on currents of moving air. The wind pushes on the north wall and forces cold air through every crack. That cold air shoves the warm air out through cracks on the south wall. It is a river of cold flowing through our home, stealing our heat. He looked at her with burning eyes. If I seal this cabin the way I would seal a firebox, the wind will have nothing to grab. The heat will stay inside. And our daughter will live. Rosa stared at him for a long moment. You want to coat our cabin in mud? She said slowly. In mortar, Bohumir corrected. The same mortar I have used for 20 years to seal fireboxes. 3 inches thick, mixed with horsehair for strength so it will not crack. I will cover every inch of the exterior walls, every crack, every gap, every place where the air can get through. Has anyone ever done this before? To a cabin? No, not that I know of. Then, how do you know it will work? Because I understand the principle, Bohumir said. His voice was steady, certain. A vessel that leaks cannot hold its contents. A vessel that is sealed will hold them perfectly. It does not matter if the vessel is a ceramic stove or a wooden cabin. The physics are the same. Rosa looked at her husband, at the intensity burning in his eyes, at the diagrams scratched in the dirt floor. She thought about what the neighbors would say if they saw their cabin coated in mud. She thought about Haddon Crail, the wealthy rancher who already looked at them with barely concealed contempt. She thought about the women at the general store, whispering behind their hands. But then she thought about Malada, about her pale face and her persistent cough, about the night she had stopped breathing, and Bohumir had forced the air back into her lungs. Another winter like this one could kill her. What if it does not work? She asked quietly. Then we will have wasted a summer of labor, Bohumir admitted, and we will leave before winter comes. I will take us east or south, wherever you want to go. I will find work. We will start over. He looked at her, and she saw the desperation beneath his certainty, the fear behind the determination. But I believe it will work, Rosa. I have spent my whole life building sealed vessels. I know how to do this. Please, give me until September. If the mortar is not perfect by then, if there are cracks, if there is any doubt at all, we will go. I promise you. But let me try. Rosa was quiet for a long time. Outside, the spring wind pressed against the cabin walls, finding every crack, every gap, every weakness in their defenses. Inside, Malada coughed in her sleep, a soft, wet sound that twisted Rosa's heart. She thought about trust, about what it meant to believe in someone when you could not see the path ahead, about what it meant to stay when every instinct screamed at you to run. She thought about the journey they had already made together, Prague to Hamburg, to New York, to Kansas. Thousands of miles, dozens of risks, countless moments when she could have turned back, but did not. And she thought about the man sitting across from her in the candlelight, with his scarred hands and his burning eyes and his impossible promise. Until September, she said finally. If it is not perfect by then, we go. Bohumir let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for trusting me." Rosa did not answer. She was not entirely sure in that moment if what she was doing could really be called trust. It felt more like desperation, like a gamble made by someone who had no other cards to play. But it was a decision, a commitment, a step forward into the unknown. And sometimes that is all you have. The work began in late May, when the ground had fully thawed and the clay could be properly mixed. Every morning, Rosa woke to find Bohumir already gone, down at the creek pit digging more clay. She would prepare breakfast for the children, then go outside to help him mix the mortar in the large wooden trough he had built for the purpose. The mixing was brutal physical labor, harder than anything Rosa had ever done. The clay was heavy and dense, sticky when wet, prone to clumping unless it was worked thoroughly with a spade or a hoe. The sand had to be added in precise proportions, a ratio Bohumir had determined through weeks of experimentation. Too much sand and the mixture would be weak, crumbling when dry. Too little, and it would shrink and crack as the water evaporated. The horsehair came last. It had to be worked into the mortar strand by strand, distributed evenly throughout the mixture, creating a fibrous skeleton that would hold the clay together as it cured. It was tedious work, requiring patience and attention, but Bohumir insisted it was essential. "The hair is like the bones in a body," he explained. "Without it, the clay is just mud. It will crack. It will fall apart. But with the hair holding it together, it becomes something stronger, something that can last." Aldrich helped when he could. He stomped the mixture with his boots, working it like a woman treading grapes. He hauled buckets of water from the creek, an endless procession back and forth across the prairie. He learned without being told that this work was important, that his family's survival might depend on it, and he threw himself into it with a determination that made Rosa's heart ache with pride. Even Milada did her part. She picked stones out of the sand pile, her small fingers surprisingly nimble. She held tools for her father, handing them up when he called for them. She was not strong enough for the heavy labor, but she wanted to help, and Bohumir made sure she always had a task, always felt included. They worked as a family, all four of them, united in purpose for the first time since leaving Prague. This is what Rosa would remember years later, when she thought back on that summer. Not the exhaustion, though there was plenty of that. Not the aching muscles and the blistered hands and the gray clay that seemed to coat everything they owned. She would remember the togetherness, the sense that they were building something, not just repairing something, that every trowel of mortar they pressed onto the logs was an act of faith, a declaration that they would survive. By early June, the first wall was covered. Bohumir worked from the bottom up, pressing the mortar into every crack and crevice between the logs, then building up the layer until it was a uniform 3 inches thick. The horsehair created a fibrous skeleton that held the clay in place, allowing it to cling to the vertical surface without sliding off. To Rosa, the effect was strange and almost disturbing. The familiar log wall was disappearing beneath a thick gray shell that looked like nothing so much as dried mud. The cabin, which had already been rough and simple, was becoming something primitive, ancient. It looked like something that might have been built thousands of years ago by people who had no other materials to work with. She tried not to think about what the neighbors would say when they saw it. The first visitor came in late June. Rosa heard the horse approaching before she saw it, the hoofbeats carrying clearly across the still summer air. She looked up from the mortar trough, wiping her clay-covered hands on her apron, and saw Haddon Crail riding toward them across the prairie. He was a big man, Crail, with the weathered face and permanent squint of someone who had spent decades in sun and wind. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and expensive boots, and he sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who owned everything he could see. People said he had been a captain in the Civil War, a hero at Antietam or Gettysburg, or one of those bloody battles whose names meant nothing to Rosa but everything to Americans. He had come to Kansas afterward, used his army savings to buy land, and built a cattle empire that made him the most powerful man in the county. He reined in his horse about 20 feet from the cabin and sat there for a long moment, looking at what they were doing. His face was unreadable. Bohumir set down his trowel and walked over to greet him, his hands still covered in gray mortar. "Good afternoon, Mr. Krail." Krail did not dismount. He simply sat there in his saddle, studying the half-covered cabin with narrowed eyes. "Vorel," he said finally. His voice was flat. "What in God's name are you doing to your cabin?" "Sealing it," Bohumir replied simply. "Against the wind." Krail was silent for a long moment. Rosa could see two other riders waiting at the edge of the property, watching from a distance. She recognized one of them as Silas Gentry, the wheat farmer who lived a few miles away. "Sealing it," Krail repeated slowly. A smile spread across his weathered face. Not a friendly smile. A pitying one. "With mud." "It is mortar," Bohumir corrected him. "The same mortar I used to build stoves in Prague. It will create an airtight shell around the logs." Krail shook his head, the smile widening into something that bordered on a laugh. "Airtight," he said. "You understand that is exactly the opposite of what you want, do you not? A cabin needs to breathe. If you seal it up completely, you will trap moisture inside the walls. Your logs will rot straight through within a year. You will be able to push your finger into the wood like it was cheese." He swung down from his horse and walked closer, his expensive boots crunching on the dry grass. He kicked at a hardened patch of mortar near the foundation. "This is foolishness, Vorel. Every man on this prairie knows you let the logs breathe. That is how it has always been done. That is what works." Bohumir shook his head calmly. "The moisture comes from the air infiltration, from the constant flow of damp outside air through the cracks. If I stop that flow, I stop the moisture." "Is that what they teach in Bohemia?" Krail asked. His voice had taken on a mocking edge. "Because here in Kansas, we have been building cabins for 30 years. We know what works and what does not. And this," he gestured at the clay-covered wall, "this is going to end very badly for you." Rosa felt her hands clench at her sides. She wanted to say something, to defend her husband, but the words stuck in her throat. Krail was so confident, so certain, and the other men were watching. And what did she know about building cabins anyway? Krail turned his attention to her, and something in his expression softened slightly. Not kindness, exactly. Pity. "Mrs. Vorel," he said, "I am sorry to have to say this to you, but you have married a madman. I have seen a lot of foolish things in my years on this prairie, but burying your own house in mud has to be the crowning achievement." He gathered his horse's reins, preparing to leave. "When this fails, Vorel, and it will fail, you can come work for me. You have good hands. I can see that. I can use a man who is willing to work hard, even if his judgment is suspect. I will pay fair wages. Better than you will make trying to farm this patch of dust." He swung back up into his saddle with the ease of long practice. "Think about it," he called down. "Before winter comes." Then he turned his horse and rode away. The other men followed him, and Rosa heard one of them laugh at something Krail said as they disappeared over the rise. She stood very still for a long moment, her clay-covered hands clenched at her sides. The humiliation burned in her chest like a hot coal. The casual contempt in Krail's voice, the assumption that they would fail, the condescending offer of charity employment, It made her blood boil in a way she had rarely experienced. Bohumir had turned back to his work without responding to Krail's parting shot. He scooped up a trowel of mortar and pressed it into the wall, his movements calm and methodical, as if nothing had happened. Rosa walked over to stand beside him. "He is wrong," she said. Bohumir paused, looking at her with surprise. "I do not know if your idea will work," Rosa continued. "I do not understand the science the way you do. But I know you. I know your craft. And I know that you have never built anything that failed." She reached down and picked up a trowel, scooped mortar from the trough. "Show me," she said, "where to apply this." Bohumir stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his eyes. The hurt from Krail's mockery was still there, but it was being pushed aside by something else. Gratitude, love, and a fierce, burning determination. He smiled at her. A real smile, the first she had seen from him in weeks. "Here," he said, pointing to a gap between two logs. "Press firmly. Work it into the crack first. Then build up the layer." They worked together in silence as the sun moved across the sky. Two people standing against the judgment of everyone around them, building something that no one believed could work. That evening, after the children were asleep, Rosa lay in bed beside her husband and listened to the wind pressing against the half-covered walls. "He is wrong," she whispered into the darkness. She was not sure if she was talking to Bohumir or to herself. "He has to be wrong." Bohumir reached over and took her hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing." Rosa squeezed his hand, but did not answer. She stared at the ceiling and wondered if what she felt could truly be called belief, or if it was just hope. Desperate, fragile hope. She supposed, in the end, it did not matter. Word spread quickly through the small community. The crazy Bohemian was burying his house in mud. The immigrants who had come to Kansas with such high hopes were building their own tomb. Every farmer and rancher within 10 miles found an excuse to ride by the Vorel homestead, slowing their horses to gawk at the strange structure taking shape. Rosa learned to ignore the stares. She learned to pretend she did not hear the comments, the laughter, the whispered jokes that fell silent whenever she walked into the general store. She focused on the work, on the children, on the slow, steady progress of the mortar coating spreading across the cabin walls. But she could not ignore what was happening to Aldrich. He came home from church one Sunday in early July, with his shirt torn and a bruise forming on his cheekbone. He would not say what had happened, would not look his mother in the eye, would only shake his head and retreat to his corner of the cabin with one of his few books. Rosa found out later from the wife of another homesteader who had witnessed the incident. A group of boys had cornered Aldrich behind the church, taunting him about his father's madness, calling his family peasants and fools, pushing him into the dirt when he tried to walk away. "Your father is building a pig pen," one of the boys had shouted. "Maybe that is where you belong. In the mud, with the pigs." Aldrich had fought back. He had thrown a punch that bloodied the biggest boy's nose before the others overwhelmed him. The adults had broken it up before any serious damage was done. But the message had been delivered. The Vorel family was not welcome in this community. That night, Rosa watched her son push his dinner around his plate, eating nothing. His face was closed off, shuttered, hiding pain that he was too proud to show. "Aldrich," she said gently, "tell me what happened." "Nothing," he muttered. "It does not matter. It matters to me." He finally looked up at her, and Rosa saw the tears he was fighting to hold back. Her brave boy, who had worked so hard all summer without complaining, who had tried so hard to help his father, who had done everything that was asked of him and more. "Why do we have to be different?" he asked, his voice cracking. Why can Father not just do things the way everyone else does? He is making us all look like fools. Everyone laughs at us. The boys at church say we are stupid peasants who do not know how to build a proper house. Rosa reached across the table and took her son's hand. Being different is not the same as being wrong, she said carefully. Your father is trying something that has never been done before. That takes courage. More courage than doing what everyone else does just because it is easier. But what if he is wrong? Aldrich demanded. What if Mr. Crail is right, and the house rots, and we lose everything? Rosa was quiet for a moment. It was a fair question. A question she had asked herself 100 times. Then we will have learned something, she said finally. We will have tried. We will have had the courage to be different. That is not the same as being stubborn. That is not the same as being proud. She squeezed his hand. I believe in your father, she said. I believe in what he is building. And even if it fails, even if we have to leave this place and start over somewhere else, I will still believe in him. I will still be proud to be his wife. Aldrich was silent for a long time, staring at the table. Then, slowly, he nodded. I will try, he whispered. I will try to believe, too. That is all I ask, Rosa said. A week after the incident at church, another visitor came to the homestead. Reverend Amos Harkin was a thin, wiry man in his late 50s who traveled a circuit of 3 counties, preaching in barns and schoolhouses and anywhere else people would gather to hear the word of God. He had a reputation for plain speaking and practical faith, for caring more about how people lived their daily lives than about the fine points of theology. He rode up to the Vorel homestead on a gray afternoon in late August, his horse tired from the long journey, his black coat dusty from the road. He did not dismount immediately. He simply sat in his saddle, studying the nearly finished cabin with its strange coating of gray clay. Rosa came out to greet him, wiping her hands on her apron. Reverend Harkin, she said, this is unexpected. Mrs. Vorel. He tipped his hat politely. I have heard stories about what your husband is doing here. I wanted to see it for myself. And what do you think? The Reverend was quiet for a long moment. His eyes moved slowly over the clay-covered walls, the trough of mortar, the pile of horsehair waiting to be mixed. I think, he said finally, that most people in this territory believe your husband is a fool. Rosa felt her shoulders tense. Yes, they do. But I also think, the Reverend continued, and his voice was thoughtful now, almost gentle, that the people who called Noah a fool were the same people who drowned in the flood. He dismounted and walked closer, running his hand over the dried mortar, feeling its texture. I do not know if this will work, Mrs. Vorel. I am a preacher, not an engineer. But I know courage when I see it. Your husband is risking ridicule and failure because he believes he can save his family. That is not foolishness. He turned to look at her with kind, tired eyes. That is faith. And faith, in my experience, is the only thing that ever really changes the world. He stayed for an hour, talking with Bohumir about the principles behind the method, asking questions that showed a surprising grasp of practical matters. When he rose to leave, he shook Bohumir's hand firmly. I will be watching, he said. And if this works, I will tell everyone I know. The plains need more men like you, Mr. Vorel, men who are willing to try. Rosa watched him ride away across the prairie, and she felt something warm kindle in her chest. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter than that. The knowledge that they were not entirely alone, that somewhere out there people were watching, waiting, ready to believe. I want to pause here and share something with you. If you are listening while doing something else, while driving or cooking or working around the house, I hope this story is keeping you company. I hope it is making you think about the people in your life who have taken risks for you, who have tried something new because they loved you. If you know someone who needs to hear about the power of belief, please share this video with them. And if you have not already, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Now let me tell you what happened as autumn approached, and how everything changed. By early September, the cabin was completely covered. Rosa stood back and looked at what they had created, and she felt a strange mixture of pride and anxiety swirling in her chest. The structure that had once been a simple log cabin now looked like something else entirely. A massive gray lump rising from the prairie. An ancient dwelling from some forgotten civilization. A monument to either genius or madness. She still could not tell which. The mortar had cured to a dense, solid shell over the 3 weeks since the last section had been applied. When Bohumir rapped his knuckles against it, the sound was like knocking on stone, a dull, solid thud. There were no visible cracks, no gaps, no weaknesses of any kind. The shell was as seamless as if it had been carved from a single block of clay. But was it enough? They would not know for certain until winter came, until the wind began to howl and the temperature dropped below zero, and they were trapped inside with no escape. If Bohumir was right, the cabin would be warm and still, a pocket of comfort in the midst of the frozen prairie. If he was wrong, Rosa tried not to think about what would happen if he was wrong. The first test came in late September, when an early cold snap brought frost and near-freezing temperatures for 3 days. Rosa insisted that they light the stove and spend the nights inside, monitoring conditions carefully. The results were encouraging. The cabin held its warmth far better than it had the previous year. There were no drafts, no cold spots, no currents of frigid air flowing along the floor. The stove burned at a fraction of its previous rate, yet the interior temperature remained steady and comfortable. But the most remarkable thing was the candle. Rosa lit one on the second night of the cold snap. She set it in the center of the table, the same spot where she had tried to read to her children the previous winter, where the flame had bent and flickered and danced in the invisible currents of air. She held her breath as the flame caught and steadied. It rose from the wick like a golden finger pointing toward heaven. It did not waver. It did not dance. It simply burned, steady as a heartbeat, still as a held breath. Minutes passed. The flame never moved. Rosa stared at it, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "Bohumir," she said quietly, "come look at this." Her husband came to stand beside her, and together they watched the candle burn. 5 minutes. 10. The flame never flickered, never bent, never showed the slightest sign that air was moving through the cabin. "It is working," Bohumir said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "The seal is holding. There are no drafts." Rosa reached out and took his hand. They stood there together in the warm, still air, watching the proof of his vision burn steadily on the table. "It is working," she repeated. "Oh, Bohumir, it is working." But even as she spoke, she knew this was only a test. A small cold snap was not a blizzard. An autumn frost was not a January ice storm. The true trial was still ahead, waiting for them in the dark, cold heart of winter, and there was no guarantee, no matter how still the candle flame burned now, that it would keep burning when the real storms came. October brought a visitor Rosa had almost forgotten. Edith Selridge drove up to the homestead in a wagon, her graying hair pulled back severely, her careworn face lined with worry. She was the woman with the sick daughter. The one Rosa had heard about from the land agent when they first arrived. The one who lived 6 miles away with a little girl about Milada's age. Over cups of weak tea, Edith explained why she had come. "Tansy is still sick," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her lungs have not gotten any better. My husband thinks I am foolish for coming here. He believes your husband's method is madness, just like everyone else says." She set down her teacup with trembling hands. "But I keep thinking, if it works, if it truly keeps the cold out the way people are starting to say it might, maybe Tansy could survive the winter." Rosa looked at this woman she barely knew. This stranger who had come 6 miles across the prairie because she was desperate to save her daughter's life. She saw her own fear reflected in Edith's red-rimmed eyes, her own sleepless nights, her own prayers to a God who seemed so far away. "I cannot promise anything," Rosa said carefully. "We have not faced a real winter storm yet. But I can tell you what my husband has done. I can explain the principle behind it." For the next hour, she did exactly that. She drew diagrams on a piece of slate, the way Bohumir had drawn them for her in the dirt floor. She explained about convection and air infiltration, about sealed vessels and thermal mass, about the physics that made it all work. She showed Edith the leftover materials beside the cabin, the horsehair and clay and sand. Edith listened intently, asking questions, taking mental notes. By the time she rose to leave, the afternoon light was fading, and she had a long drive ahead. "I will tell my husband," she said, standing in the doorway. "I do not know if he will agree to try it, but at least now I understand what we would be trying to do." She paused, looking back at Rosa. "I hope it works, Mrs. Vorel. I hope it works for both of us." Rosa watched her drive away across the golden autumn prairie, and she felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. If Bohumir's method worked, it would not just save Milada. It could save Tansy Selridge. It could save children across the territory. It could change everything. But first, it had to survive the winter. November brought the first true cold of the season. The temperature dropped. The wind intensified. Snow fell, light at first, then heavier, piling against the sealed walls of the cabin in drifts that had to be shoveled away from the door each morning. Rosa watched Milada constantly, looking for the coughing fits that had plagued her the previous winter. They did not come. The cabin was warm. Not hot, not stifling, but genuinely, comfortably warm. The cast-iron stove burned at a steady, economical rate, consuming half the wood it had devoured the previous year. The air inside was still and peaceful, untouched by the drafts that had made life so miserable before. And the candle, whenever Rosa lit it, stood perfectly straight. But outside the sealed walls, the social isolation deepened. Rosa had never been a woman who needed many friends. In Prague, she had been content with a small circle of colleagues from the school, a few neighbors she exchanged pleasantries with. But here in Kansas, where the nearest neighbor was miles away, and most of them had decided she was married to a lunatic, the loneliness began to weigh on her. She saw it affecting her family, too. Aldrich had retreated into himself, spending hours reading the few books they had brought from Prague, refusing to talk about what had happened at church. He had not returned to services since the incident with the boys, and Rosa had not forced him. She told herself it was because the weather was too uncertain, but she knew the truth. She was protecting him from further humiliation. Even Bohumir, normally so focused on his work that he barely noticed the world around him, had grown quieter. He still rose early and worked hard, cutting wood for winter, making repairs to their equipment, preparing for the storms ahead. But he no longer talked about his plans the way he once had. The constant mockery, the shaking heads, the pitying looks. they had taken something from him. He still believed in what he had built. Rosa was certain of that. But the joy had gone out of the work. One evening in late November, Rosa found Bohumir sitting alone on the porch of the cabin, staring out at the snow-covered prairie. The wind was calm for once, and the stars blazed overhead with a brilliance that never failed to take her breath away. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and went to sit beside him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Bohumir was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My father," he said finally. Rosa said nothing, just waited. "He was a Kamnaj too," Bohumir continued, "a master of the craft. He taught me everything I know. When I was a boy, I watched him build a stove for the mayor of our village, the most beautiful stove I had ever seen. Tiles glazed with cobalt blue, smoke channels curved like the inside of a seashell. It took him 6 months to complete." He paused, and Rosa could see the memory playing behind his eyes. The mayor refused to pay, said the work was not up to standard, said any flaws that appeared would be my father's responsibility. He threatened to ruin our family unless my father accepted half the agreed price. What did your father do? He took the half payment. He said nothing in his own defense. He let the mayor tell everyone that the stove was flawed, even though it was perfect, even though we both knew the truth. Bohumir's voice grew harder. "I swore I would never do that. Never accept someone else's judgment of my work when I knew it was good. Never let them tell me that what I built was worthless when I knew it had value." He looked at Rosa, and she saw the pain beneath his resolve. "But it is harder than I thought it would be. Hearing them laugh, seeing them shake their heads. Sometimes I wonder if I am just like my father, too proud to admit when I am wrong, too stubborn to listen to people who know this land better than I do." Rosa reached out and took his hand. "Your father gave up," she said gently. "He accepted their judgment, even though he knew it was wrong. You have not done that. You built what you believed in, and now you are waiting to see if you were right." She squeezed his hand firmly. "That is not stubbornness. That is not pride. That is courage, and I am proud of you for having it." She leaned closer, resting her head against his shoulder. "I believe in you," she said. "I believe in what you built. And even if it fails, even if we have to leave this place and start over somewhere else, I will still believe in you. I will still be proud to be your wife." Bohumir was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for believing. I do not think I could have done this alone." "You are not alone," Rosa said. "You never were." They sat together in the cold starlight. Two people who had traveled halfway around the world together, who had faced doubt and mockery and the very real possibility of failure. They did not know what the winter would bring. They did not know if the cabin would hold, but they knew they would face it together. And sometimes, that is all you need. The storm warnings began in early January. The old-timers, the men and women who had survived decades on the plains, watched the sky with worried faces. They spoke in low voices about barometric pressure, about the color of the clouds, about the strange behavior of the animals. The woolly caterpillars were darker than usual. The geese had flown south earlier than anyone could remember. The cattle were growing thick winter coats that spoke of harsh months ahead. Something big was coming, they said. Something that would test every homestead on the prairie. Haddon Crale sent one of his ranch hands to the Vorel cabin with a message. "Mr. Crale wants you to know that you are welcome at the ranch when the storm comes," the young man said. He was barely 20, uncomfortable with the errand, unable to meet Bohumir's eyes. He says you should not try to ride it out in... He gestured vaguely at the clay-covered cabin. He says he will send a wagon for you if you want. Bohumir's face was calm, unreadable. Tell Mr. Krail I appreciate his concern. But we will stay here. The ranch hand shifted on his feet. Mr. Krail said you might say that. He told me to tell you that he does not want your deaths on his conscience. He says if you stay and something happens, it will not be his fault. I understand, Bohumir said quietly. We will stay. After the young man had ridden away, Rosa came to stand beside her husband. They watched the messenger disappear over the rise, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of snow. Perhaps we should go, Rosa said quietly. Just in case. Milada is better, but she is still not strong. If something goes wrong... Bohumir turned to look at her. His dark eyes searched her face. Do you want to go? Rosa thought about it carefully. She thought about the candle flame standing still on the table, about the warm, quiet nights they had spent in the sealed cabin while the wind howled outside, about everything Bohumir had built, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had endured. She thought about what it would mean to leave now, to run to Haddon Krail's ranch, to admit that they could not trust their own work, to spend the winter as charity cases in the home of the man who had mocked them, who had called her husband a madman, who had predicted their failure with such smug certainty. No, she said finally, I do not want to go. I want to stay here, with you, in the house you built for us. Bohumir nodded slowly. Then, that is what we will do. He reached out and pulled her close. Together they stood looking at the gray sky, the snow already beginning to fall, the wind beginning to rise. Whatever comes, Rosa said, we face it together. Together, Bohumir agreed. The storm hit on the second Tuesday of January. It came not like weather, but like war. The sky turned black in the middle of the morning, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the sun. The wind rose from a whisper to a moan to a shriek that drowned out all other sounds. Snow began to fall, not gently drifting down, but driving horizontally through the air with the force of thrown sand. Within an hour, visibility dropped to nothing, a whiteout so complete that Rosa could not see her hand when she held it in front of her face. The world beyond the cabin walls simply ceased to exist, replaced by a howling white void that seemed to go on forever. For 4 days, that void tried to kill them. On the first day, Rosa kept busy. She cooked meals on the cast-iron stove, keeping a pot of stew simmering constantly so the cabin smelled of meat and vegetables and warmth. She played games with the children, read aloud from their small collection of books, organized and reorganized their meager supplies. But as the hours passed, she found herself glancing constantly at the walls, at the sealed logs hidden beneath their shell of clay, at the candle burning on the table. The flame was still straight, still perfect, still utterly unwavering. On the second day, the temperature dropped so low that the logs of the cabin cracked and popped as they contracted. The sound was terrifying, like gunshots in the dark, and Milada woke crying in the middle of the night, convinced that the house was falling down around them. But the walls held. The mortar did not crack. The seal remained intact. The stove burned steadily, and the cabin stayed warm. On the third day, Rosa allowed herself to hope. She thought about Haddon Krail in his big ranch house, with its drafty walls and its massive fireplaces. She thought about Silas Gentry, huddled with his family around a roaring fire, burning through their woodpile at a terrifying rate. She thought about Edith Selridge and little Tansy, who had not had time to seal their cabin before winter came. And she thought about what it would mean if they survived this storm. If Bohumir's method worked under these conditions, truly worked, then nothing would ever be the same. Not for them. Not for anyone. On the evening of the third day, Bohumir lit a fresh candle and placed it in the center of the table. The whole family gathered around it. Aldrich and Melada on either side of their parents. All of them watching in silence as the flame caught and steadied. It stood straight up, motionless, perfect. A tiny golden sentinel in the warm, still air. Minutes passed. No one spoke. The wind screamed outside, battering the walls with everything it had, and the flame did not move. Melada looked up at her mother, her dark eyes wide with wonder. "Why is everyone looking at the candle, Mama?" "Because it tells us something important," Rosa said. Her voice was thick with emotion. "What does it tell?" "That we are safe. That the wind cannot reach us here." She looked at Bohumir, at the tears streaming down his weathered face, and she felt her own eyes filling. "That your father was right." Bohumir could not speak. He simply pulled his family close, wrapping his arms around all of them, holding them together in the warm, still air, while the worst storm in 50 years raged just inches away. Rosa felt something break inside her. Not something bad. Something that had been holding her back, holding her tight, keeping her from fully believing. The tears came then, not tears of sorrow, tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming joy. They had made it. They had survived. The faith she had placed in her husband, the decision she had made to stay when everyone told her to go, it had been the right choice. "Thank you," she whispered, to Bohumir, to God, to whatever force had led them through doubt and mockery to this moment of perfect proof. The candle flame burned on, straight and true, a small golden miracle that defied everything they had been told about survival on the plains. I want to pause here, because this moment, this single image of a flame standing still while the world outside tears itself apart, this is what faith looks like when it is rewarded. Have you ever had a moment like this? When everything you believed in was finally proven true? When all the doubt and mockery fell away, and you knew deep in your bones that you had been right to trust? If you have, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below. These moments are precious. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be shared. Now let me tell you what happened when the storm finally broke. The blizzard ended on the 5th day. The wind died as suddenly as it had risen. The snow stopped falling. The clouds parted to reveal a sky so blue and pure that it almost hurt to look at. The sun rose on a transformed world, a landscape of sculpted white drifts and impossible silence, as if the blizzard had scrubbed everything clean and left behind only stillness. The Vorel cabin was nearly buried. Only the roof and the top portion of the stone chimney were visible above the drifts that had piled against the walls. But from that chimney, a thin, lazy curl of gray smoke rose into the frigid morning air. The house was alive. Inside, the temperature was 68 degrees. The stove had been burning low and steady for 4 days, and the woodpile beside it was still half full. They had used less fuel in the worst blizzard in living memory than they had used in a single night during their first winter in the cabin. Bohumir was first to venture outside. He dug a passage through the snow that blocked the door, working for nearly an hour before he broke through to the brilliant sunshine. He emerged blinking into the light and stood for a moment, breathing the cold, clean air, looking out at the alien white landscape. An hour later, he saw riders approaching. There were 3 of them, struggling through the deep snow on horseback. Their animals labored with every step, sinking to their chests in the drifts. As they grew closer, Rosa, who had come outside to stand beside her husband, recognized Haddon Crail in the lead. His face was drawn with exhaustion. There were dark circles under his eyes and ice crystals in his beard. And there was something in his expression that Rosa had never seen there before. Fear. They reined in their horses near the cabin, and Crail dismounted slowly, every movement seeming to cause him pain. He walked toward them through the snow, his expensive boots sinking with every step. "Vorel," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Are you all right?" "We are well," Bohumir replied simply. "God has been good." Crail stared at him, then at the cabin, then at the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. He seemed unable to comprehend what he was seeing. "We came to dig you out," he said slowly, "to see if you were... if anyone had." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Bohumir stepped aside and gestured toward the snow tunnel that led to the door. "Come inside. Out of the cold." Crail hesitated for a moment. Then he followed Bohumir through the tunnel and into the cabin. Rosa watched from the doorway as the rancher stepped inside and stopped, frozen in place, looking around with an expression of utter disbelief. The cabin was warm, genuinely, comfortably warm. Not the desperate, fleeting warmth of a roaring fire, but a gentle, even, steady warmth that seemed to fill every corner of the small space. The children were playing on the floor, Aldrich reading a book while Malada drew pictures on a small slate. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with the rich smell of meat and vegetables. The air itself was still and peaceful, untouched by the killing wind outside, and on the table a candle was burning. Crail walked toward that candle as if pulled by an invisible force. He stood over it, looking down, watching the flame. His weathered face was slack with shock. The flame had not moved. Not once in 4 days. It burned now exactly as it had burned when the storm began. A small golden miracle that defied everything Crail thought he knew about survival on the plains. He reached out, almost reverently, and held his bare palm a few inches from the flame. He moved it slowly around, feeling for drafts, for currents of air, for any sign of the wind that should have been howling through the walls. There was nothing. He turned to the nearest wall and pressed his palm flat against the interior surface of the logs. Rosa knew what he was expecting to feel. The biting cold of wood that was bleeding its warmth to the outside. The telltale chill of a house that was losing its fight against the winter. But that was not what he felt. The wood was cool, neutral. It was not stealing warmth from his hand. It was simply there, a barrier between inside and outside that was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Crail turned slowly to face Bohumir. His weathered face had changed. The mockery was gone. The contempt had vanished. In their place was something Rosa had never expected to see on that proud face. Humility and awe. "My God," he whispered, "you did it. You actually did it." He took a shaky breath. "I have been on this prairie for 20 years. I have seen blizzards that killed whole herds of cattle. I have buried friends who froze to death in their own homes. I have watched families give up and leave because they could not face another winter." He gestured at the walls, at the candle, at the warm, still air. "And in all that time, I never imagined anything like this." He looked at Bohumir with new eyes, eyes that held respect and wonder. "You did not just plaster your cabin," he said slowly. "You built a lung that holds its breath." Crail was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "Mrs. Varel," he said, turning to face Rosa, "I owe you an apology. I called your husband a madman. I pitied you for following him. I was wrong. I was so very, very wrong." Rosa looked at this man who had made their lives harder with his mockery, who had told everyone they would fail, who had offered them charity as if they were helpless children. But she also saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the humility that must have cost him dearly, the willingness to admit his mistake, openly, in front of witnesses. "You were not wrong, Mr. Crail," she said quietly. "You just did not know. Now you do." Crail nodded slowly. He turned back to Bohemir. "I would like to hire you," he said, "to supervise the ceiling of my ranch house. I will pay whatever you ask." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I will tell everyone what I have seen here today. I will tell them I was wrong. That Bohumir Vorel is not a madman. He is a genius." Bohumir was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I will seal your house," he said, "but not for money, not for praise. I will do it because the method works, and because every family that uses it is a family that will survive. That is all I ever wanted." Crail extended his hand. Bohumir took it. A simple gesture. Two men who had been enemies. Now something different. Not quite friends, but no longer adversaries. Partners in something bigger than either of them. But amidst all the relief, all the vindication, there was also tragedy. In late February, Edith Selridge came to the homestead. Rosa saw the wagon approaching and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something in the way Edith sat, hunched over the reins, told her that this was not a social visit. Edith climbed down from the wagon slowly, moving like an old woman though she was barely 40. Her face was gaunt, haggard, the face of someone who had not slept in weeks. Her eyes were red from weeping. Rosa knew, even before Edith spoke, what had happened. "Tansy did not survive the storm," Edith said. Her voice was flat, hollow, drained of all emotion. "She died on the third night. Her lungs they could not. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, her whole body shaking with grief." Rosa held her, rocked her gently, the way she would rock a child, said nothing, because there was nothing to say. No words that could bring back a 4-year-old girl, no comfort that could fill the hole left by a daughter's death. "My husband would not listen," Edith said when she could speak again. She pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He said your method was foolish. He said we would look ridiculous if we coated our house in mud. He said it was better to trust the ways that had always worked." She looked at Rosa, her face ravaged with grief. "But the ways that had always worked killed my daughter. The drafts, the cold, the constant wind pouring through the walls. It was too much for her. She was only 4 years old. She never had a chance." Rosa felt her own tears streaming down her face. She thought about Malada, sleeping peacefully in the warm cabin, alive and healthy because her father had dared to try something new. She thought about what might have been, if she had insisted they leave, if she had lost faith, if she had let the mockery and doubt drive them away. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I am so very, very sorry." "I came here to tell you something," Edith said. She took Rosa's hands in hers, gripping them tightly. "I came to tell you that I should have listened. I should have pushed harder. I should have demanded that we try your husband's method, even if it seemed foolish, even if everyone laughed at us." She drew a shaky breath. "Do not let what happened to my Tansy happen to other children. Tell everyone, Mrs. Vorel. Spread this knowledge as far as you can. Make them understand that this works, that it saves lives. We will, Rosa promised, her voice thick with tears. I swear to you, we will. Edith stayed for an hour, crying and talking and crying some more. When she finally left, Rosa stood in the doorway of her warm, still cabin and watched the wagon disappear across the snow-covered prairie. She thought about Tansy Selridge, a little girl she had never met, who had been the same age as Malata, who had had the same weak lungs, who had faced the same deadly winter. One child had lived, one had died. And the only difference, the only thing that separated life from death, was a 3-inch shell of clay and horsehair. In that moment, Rosa understood that what they had built here was more than a method of construction. It was a responsibility, a sacred trust. They had discovered something that could save lives, and they had a duty to share it with everyone who would listen. She went inside and found Bohumir sitting at the table, staring at the candle that still burned straight and true. I need to talk to you, she said, about what happens next. Spring came to the Flint Hills, and with it, change. Bohumir continued his work, traveling from homestead to homestead, supervising the mixing of mortar, demonstrating the technique, watching as other men applied the clay to their own walls with hands that grew more confident each day. He did not charge for his labor. He asked only for materials and food, for the chance to spread his method as widely as possible. The families he helped were grateful, and they spread the word to their neighbors, who spread it to their neighbors, until the Vorel shell, as people had begun to call it, was the talk of the entire region. But Rosa took on a different role. She began teaching. In Prague, she had been a school teacher, skilled at explaining complex ideas in simple terms, at making the abstract concrete, at helping people understand things that had seemed impossible before. Now she used those skills to spread the knowledge that could save lives. She held classes in the local church, standing before groups of farm wives and homesteaders, using diagrams and simple models to explain the principles behind the method. She talked about convection and air infiltration, about sealed vessels and thermal barriers, about the physics that made it all work. But more than the science, she talked about faith. She talked about what it meant to try something new, even when everyone said it would fail. She talked about the courage it took to be different, to endure mockery and doubt, to keep working when the whole world was telling you to give up. She talked about Tansy Selridge and the terrible price of hesitation. And people listened. They listened because Rosa was one of them, a mother who had faced the same fears they faced, who had made the same impossible choices. They listened because she spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through it, who had watched her daughter nearly die, and had found a way to save her. They listened because the candle flame in the Vorel cabin still burned straight and true, a testament to everything she was saying. By the autumn of 1893, more than 40 families had sealed their homes using the Vorel method. The Reverend Amos Harkin, true to his word, had begun telling the story of the still flame in his sermons. The tale spread from town to town, from church to church, becoming something larger than itself. It became a legend, a parable, a story of faith and courage and the triumph of innovation over tradition. And at the center of it all was a small family of immigrants who had come to Kansas with nothing but hope and a willingness to try. The last scene of this story takes place on a night in late November of 1893. The Vorel cabin, now famous throughout the region, sat quietly on its rise overlooking the prairie. The clay shell had been touched up here and there, the mortar repaired where minor cracks had appeared over the summer. but the basic structure was the same as it had been when Bohumir finished it more than a year before. Inside, the family gathered around the table for dinner. Aldrich, now 11 years old, had grown several inches over the past year. He was taller, more confident, his earlier shyness replaced by a quiet self-assurance that made Rosa's heart swell with pride. He had returned to church, where the boys who had once bullied him now treated him with something approaching respect. Several of their fathers had hired Bohumir to seal their cabins. Milada, 7 years old now, was the picture of health. Her cheeks were rosy, her dark eyes bright with life, her voice strong and clear. She had not had a serious coughing fit in nearly a year. The traveling doctor who had warned Rosa that another winter might kill her had come by the previous spring to check on her progress. He had shaken his head slowly, a smile spreading across his tired face. "Whatever you are doing," he said to Rosa, "keep doing it. This child is thriving." Bohumir sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands folded in front of him. He was tired from a long day of work, another cabin sealed, another family protected. But there was a contentment in his face that Rosa had not seen since their early years in Prague. He had found his purpose again. He was building things that mattered, and Rosa, sitting across from her husband, looking at the family she had brought through fire and ice and doubt, felt something she had almost forgotten was possible: peace. After dinner, as the children helped clear the dishes, Milada asked a question. "Mama, can I light the candle?" Rosa smiled. She knew what this ritual meant to her daughter. How the child had come to associate the candle flame with safety, with warmth, with the knowledge that the killing wind could not touch them here. "Of course," she said. Milada took a match from the box on the shelf and struck it carefully, the way her father had taught her. She touched the flame to the wick of the tallow candle and watched as the fire caught and grew. The flame stood motionless in the warm air, a tiny golden sentinel keeping watch over the family it had helped to save. Milada clapped her hands in delight. "It is not dancing, Mama. The flame is not dancing." "No," Rosa said, pulling her daughter close. "It is not dancing, because our house does not breathe. Our house holds its warmth like a closed fist, like a mother holding her children." She looked across the table at Bohumir, who was watching them with tears glistening in his eyes. "Your father built that," she said to Milada. "He built the walls that keep us safe." She kissed the top of her daughter's dark hair. "But do you know what I built?" Milada shook her head. "I built faith," Rosa said quietly. "I believed in your father when no one else did. I stayed when it would have been easier to go. I trusted him with everything I had, everything we had, because I believed in who he was." She held her daughter close. "And someday, when you are grown, you will understand that faith is sometimes the hardest thing to build. But it is also the most important. More important than walls. More important than shelters. More important than anything else in this world." Milada nodded seriously, as if she understood, though Rosa knew the full weight of those words would not land for many years yet. Bohumir rose from his seat and came to stand beside his wife and daughter. He put one hand on Rosa's shoulder and the other on Milada's head, and together they stood in the warm, still air, watching the candle burn. Outside, the wind was rising. Winter was coming again. The temperature was dropping, and soon the snow would fall, and the blizzards would howl across the prairie just as they always had. But it held no terror for them anymore. They had built something stronger than the wind. They had built a home that held its breath. And they had built a family that held each other, through every storm, through every doubt, through every long, dark night of the soul. The candle flame stood straight and still, a tiny beacon of hope in the vastness of the prairie. And Rosa Vorel, looking at that flame, thought about all the mothers across the plains who were watching similar flames tonight. Mothers whose children would live because of what her husband had discovered. Mothers who had found the courage to try something new, to trust someone they loved, to believe in the impossible. She thought about Tansy Selridge, and she said a silent prayer for the child's soul. Then she looked at Malata, alive and healthy and safe, and she whispered the only words that mattered. "Thank you." Years later, when people asked Rosa Vorel what she remembered most about that time, she did not talk about the clay or the horsehair or the physics of convection. She talked about the candle. She talked about standing in her warm cabin on the 4th night of the worst blizzard anyone could remember, watching a tiny flame burn straight and true while the world outside tried to tear itself apart. She talked about what it felt like to trust someone completely, to bet everything on a person instead of a proof. To stay when leaving would have been so much easier. "That is faith," she would say to anyone who asked. Not knowing the answer, but trusting the person who is searching for it. Not waiting for proof, but standing beside someone while they try to create it. Her husband built a wall against the wind, but Rosa built something stronger. She built belief, and in the end, that made all the difference. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched your heart, if it made you think about the people you believe in and the faith that sustains you, I would be honored if you would share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have a story of your own, about faith, about trust, about believing in someone when the world said you were wrong, I would love to hear it in the comments. Until next time, may your flame burn straight and true. This story was created for educational and entertainment purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical building techniques and scientific principles. The characters and specific events are products of creative imagination. Any application of historical building methods should be undertaken with consideration of current building codes and professional guidance.